During the darkest era in the history of our country, many Christian slave owners would use the Bible to support slavery. But the question remains, what does the Bible teach on this subject of slavery? That's coming up next on The Beat. Hey everyone, my name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. Here on The Beat, we release a new video every single Tuesday, and today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
I should like to clarify the fact that unless that difference is that slavery in the Bible does not refer to the actual ownership of another human being, all of this will be for nothing. I say that because that fact and that fact alone is enough to destroy any claim to any sort of ethical nature that the Bible can be argued to have. Owning another human being is a violation of that person's human rights. The small details on how said ownership takes place is about as relevant as the details surrounding a premeditated murder. Sure, there are things that can make said act even more atrocious, such as the build-up of further human rights violations, but there's not a single thing I can think of that can stop the ownership of another person being a violation of said human rights. So I will be interested to see which direction you take this and how that all stacks up against the narrative displayed throughout the Bible.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather He regulated it. And so, just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so He had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves. And so the very fact that there is a law about it at all indicates that God did not approve of it, and it wasn't His perfect will, because God did not establish laws to regulate or limit good, only to regulate evil.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. To say that your proposed God was not in support of slavery but simply managed it is incredibly dishonest. Fact is, we can apply your argument to any other sin such as murder and ask why murder was forbidden while slavery was regulated. The fact is, your God had many opportunities to speak out against slavery as a concept and yet did not do so. Instead, He took time to condemn the jealousy felt over your neighbor's slaves whilst telling Moses the 10 Commandments, whilst completely failing to condemn slavery at all. The further problem with your argument comes in the fact that you believe your God to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and the very definition of justice. When you say He knew the nature of man and therefore could do nothing but regulate slavery, what you are effectively saying is that your proposed God failed to do what man has since achieved. In the West, we the people abolished legal slavery. Not some god, but people. We did in the space of a couple of centuries what the gods apparently never could over many millennia. So your response not only fails in that it ignores the scriptural evidence that clearly demonstrates a lack of knowledge on your part, but it also manages to falsify the very existence of your proposed God. Either He could do nothing to end slavery, in which case He's not all-powerful. He didn't know of slavery, in which case you have to explain the contradictions found in the Bible where He openly talks about it. Or perhaps He just doesn't believe slavery to be truly immoral, in which case the first point stands. Yet most likely of all, your God just doesn't exist, period. The point I'm trying to make is, no matter your poison, this argument ultimately refutes some aspect or the entirety of your deity.
Number two, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see, was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years.
Considering the Answers in Genesis article you have linked on the matter, I have to assume that this is reference to Exodus chapter 21, to which Answers in Genesis compares slavery to college and university. The argument surrounds the following passage. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he must remain your slave for 6 years. But in the 7th year you must set him free, without cost to him. If he was single at the time you bought him, he alone must be set free. But if he was married at the time, both he and his wife must be given their freedom. If you give him a wife and they have children, only the man himself must be set free. His wife and children remain the property of his owner. But suppose that the slave loves his wife and children so much that he won't leave without them. Then he must stand beside either the door or the doorpost at the place of worship, while his owner punches a small hole through one of his ears with a sharp metal rod. This makes him a slave for life. Now there are a few things to note about this passage that are so often ignored by those reporting it to show slavery of the Bible is not in fact what is often termed harsh slavery, the very phrase and existence of which is vile. The first thing to note is that this solely refers to Hebrew men who are either born free or have been set free at one point in their life. Hebrew women, those born into slavery, as well as people of different nations, are not included under these rules. Now I need to note that the word nation here is incredibly problematic for you because nation does not refer to the line in the sand concept we know of today. Instead, it refers to what we today would call ethnicity. That is the shared history of cultural practices and identity. So the slavery being described here is nearly identical to the slavery witnessed in the West following the Christianization of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christendom across the lands in which, over time, it became more justifiable to enslave people of other ethnicities, resulting in the image of slavery we most vividly recognize today. Enslaving people of African heritage is well and truly greenlit by this passage, which makes an in-group, out-group distinction on who you can and cannot enslave permanently. But even the, quote, limited slavery of the Hebrew men is atrocious. Consider the fact that Moses, and through him your God, is laying down a hostage situation which exists in how people are used as livestock to force men to choose between their family or their freedom. This isn't so much a release as it is a vile game created by vile people.
This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional. So in other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt. Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional, which leads me to my fourth point, which is that kidnapping, according to Exodus chapter 21, in any and all circumstances was completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And so this idea that you could take somebody against their will and make them your slave was not only against the law, but it was outside of the will of God.
So you assert that Exodus chapter 21 verse 16 refers to people of all ethnicities being kidnapped, whilst this actually takes place inside the very same chapter discussing the very special provisions surrounding the Hebrews. Fact is, this rule only applies to other Hebrews in the exact same way that the commandment, thou shalt not murder, only applies on the very same in-group basis. We see this with murder in how Moses, as he comes down from the mountain carrying this very commandment, sees many people worshipping the golden calf. So what was his response to this? Well, he rallies those still part of his in-group, the Hebrews still loyal to Yahweh, and has them slaughter 3,000 innocent people, who were completely defenseless and thus demonstrating the in-group basis. Likewise, I can look further into the Bible to where Moses, the very person who set down the law you just brought up, allows for the slaves of conquered nations to be taken against their will, aka kidnapping. In Numbers chapter 31 verses 1 through 18, we have another story of your God supposedly ordering the mass genocide of an outgroup. However, this time there's a twist in that the men take the small boys and the women as slaves. And yes, God is angry. But he's not angry because they've taken slaves, they've kidnapped slaves. He's angry because he wanted all of them to die. But Moses, the very man who made the law which you just quoted, tells them that they can keep the virgin girls as slaves to rape as the spoils of war, so long as they butcher the non-virgin women and the young boys. These young girls were not only kidnapped, they saw their entire family wiped out and were then raped. This goes back to what I said earlier in how you can't decrease the atrocity of a human rights violation, but you can certainly increase it by having multiple human rights violations. And in the end, all of this therefore proves that both you and Answers in Genesis have quote mined for a law that only applies to Hebrews being kidnapped and sold, and applied that as some universal standard, when the very creator of that law demonstrates otherwise with their very actions, their very commands. So your raw assertion that slavery was mostly volitional does not stand up to scrutiny at all. But it's true, volitional slavery when it came to Hebrew men had special conditions. But for everyone else, the reality is still the same horrific standard of ownership seen throughout Europe and throughout America until abolition. It must be rather embarrassing to have an atheist correct your dishonest portrayal of the passages you are using. I'm the one demonstrating the actual context of these laws, whilst you are the one ignoring that.
Number 5, slavery was limited to just 6 years, and so the idea here is that it was never God's heart for the rich to overtake or control the poor. On the contrary, this system was set up so that slaves or people who were in debt could work off their debt in a safe and loving environment, and then after 6 years, they were not only to go free, but also the master was commanded as an act of kindness to put something in their hands and send them on their way, which was in direct contrast to what has been practiced in our country.
And just like in Exodus, the passage in Deuteronomy you are now using is very clear that this rule only applies to Hebrew slaves, allowing for the slaves of other ethnic groups to be kept permanently without any such regulations. But what's more is that this passage declares slavery not to be done out of some economic benevolence like you and Answers in Genesis have asserted. It states that the amount of work they have done will easily be worth double that of a hired hand. So the chapter from which you dug up this quote completely refutes your earlier point.
Number 6, slave owners were to treat slaves with respect. The Bible says in Leviticus chapter 25 that slave owners were commanded to treat slaves as employees or hired workers in terms of the type of work that they gave them.
If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Is the full passage when you haven't cropped off the start. Once again, this demonstrates that this in-group, out-group basis that existed in European and American slavery exists here as well.
Not only this, but if a slave owner was guilty of killing a slave, he would be facing severe punishment himself.
This is once again found in the chapter of Exodus, which lays down the special rules for Hebrew slaves, and it is passages like these that make me still refer to them as Hebrew slaves rather than simply servants because of the treatment they receive. The Bible is 100% okay with you beating another human being so long as you own them. To call that respect, because if said Hebrew dies, only then will action be taken, is disgraceful. But the article you linked takes the absurdity further in claiming that the passage just before this one, which lays out the law for two non-slave Hebrew men fighting, pretending that the two are the same. The fact is, in the passage discussing the brawl, it notes that unless the person dies as a result of their injuries, there will be no death penalty for the culprit. Instead, they merely have to pay compensation. So to reiterate, if they're hurt, pay compensation. If they die, then it's the death penalty. When it comes to the Hebrew slaves, however, contrary to what you have asserted and what Answers in Genesis asserts, this is not the case. The Hebrew slave can die as a result of their wounds. so long as it's not within 2 days of their initial beating. And the fact is, the punishment, if they die within these 2 days, is left ambiguous. I don't know whether it's a fine or the death penalty. And as for everyone else, outside this chapter, which clearly sets itself talking about the Hebrew in-group and Hebrew slaves, but at least you, unlike Answers in Genesis, didn't try to further justify the beating in claiming that the slaves were lazy and had it coming.
Third of all, they were commanded to maintain the family unity. And so if a slave came to you and he was already married with children, after the 6 years were up, he and his wife and his children were to go free, which was in direct contrast to what was happening in our country.
Well, as I demonstrated earlier, that quote is very dishonestly clipped to remove the fact that the slave owner kept any wife taken during the Hebrew slaves' enslavement, as well as any child born to them during that time. That's how the slave owner could keep even a Hebrew slave permanently. You could not have missed this in reading either the Bible or the Answers in Genesis article, because both very clearly note this fact. Ergo, this can only be a deliberate lie on your part. As for the slaves of other non-Hebrew ethnic groups, the slave owners had free reign when it came to their ownership and selling off their family unit in whichever way they desired. So no, it is not different to what happened in America at all.
Finally, God made it very clear that a master was buying simply the services and not the servant, because it's very clear that no man can own another man like they can own an animal, because all of us were created in the image of God and all of us belong to God as servants.
So that was Leviticus chapter 25 verse 55, and once again specifically mentions the Israelites, the in-group rule. Meanwhile, 11 verses earlier, so verses 44 to 46 from the very same chapter, states the following. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy your slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So here we have the Bible talking about not only the fact that you can own slaves from other nations for life, but the fact that you can inherit these slaves as well as property, on that provision that they do come from other ethnic groups, these vaguely fluid nations at the time. So how then do you assert that the God of the Bible clearly states that human beings can never be property, when it is talking about people being passed on as property rights? How do you warp your own scripture in such a way? By ignoring the racist aspect of said slavery, which differentiated between the in-group ethnicity and the out-group ethnicity? What next?
And number 7, slavery was never based on race. And so nowhere in the Bible does it condone enslaving a race of people, rather only individuals, and that on a voluntary basis.
Literally, everything about slavery in the Bible divides things by ethnicity. You have the Hebrew in-group, who can never be owned permanently, save for a single loophole involving a hostage situation. And then you have the non-Hebrew out-group, who isn't offered a single protection throughout the entire Bible. White slavery by white people has happened, but most of that is distant history. The history of slavery we learn about and recognize is the slavery which based itself in exactly what the Hebrews did. It simply replaced Hebrew with white Christian, and millions suffered. Hell, that's likely the only reason you are preaching today, because Christianity and the Bible was not only used to justify slavery as God ordained, but also pacify said slaves into accepting the brutality they suffered.
So does the Bible make concessions for and have laws that regulate and ensure the proper treatment of slaves? I would have to say yes. But does it support the degradation or the mistreatment of slaves that we saw in our country for nearly 400 years? Absolutely not.
When I started this video, I laid down one very basic condition that I would have expected you to meet were you to prove and convince me that slavery in the Bible was okay. And that was to demonstrate that said slavery was not the ownership of people. You have failed to do anything close to that. But what is more is that every point you have tried to make to lessen the atrocity of slavery in the Bible does not stand up to scrutiny. Almost all of what you have said is pulled apart if you read the surrounding passages or if you look at the Bible as a whole. Not just a single phrase you have quote-mined and even edited, as you have done here repeatedly. As noted, there are two clear places where God talks about the ownership of people as slavery. We have it in one of the 10 Commandments that tells you not to covet your neighbor's slaves along with their livestock, property, and even wife, because yes, the Hebrews saw their wife as property. Then we have the passage which details that lifelong slaves of non-Hebrew ethnicity can be owned till the day they die, and as a result can be passed to the next generation by inheritance. And the fact that you consider rape and brutal beatings to count as proper treatment reminds me very well as to why we still need to be scared of Christianity. There are a few things which I'd just like to add here at the end of this video. The first is a massive thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me via Patreon. Your fantastic support has given me the ability to keep this channel going, and I hope to continue producing content in the years to come. Secondly, I would like to thank anyone who has ever interacted with this channel. Your shares, likes and dislikes, as well as your comments of both approval and disapproval, have ensured constant feedback allowing me to improve my work. Last of all, I would like to express my desire that you treat any of the people displayed throughout the video with respect. Whilst it is true that ideas do not demand respect, and there are many in fact which deserve reprehension, we must be careful on how we tackle said ideas in ensuring we are not simply targeting the person. In short, be the compassionate side of reason. So take care, and I'll see you next time.